Chairman Mendelson, Chairman Grosso, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the budget of DC Public Schools and the Deputy Mayor for Education. We are EmpowerEd teacher leaders, and we believe strongly in the need to ensure that all policy conversations in education center around those most affected, our students and those closest to their experiences, parents and educators. Over a month ago, we released an educator-created education recovery plan to address critical issues and propose reopenings of schools and for an equitable recovery. There are several things we'd like to highlight today that affect that process and the budget of these agencies.
First, we are concerned that no plan for education recovery will be successful if the city does not make deeper investments in the struggling childcare industry. Without childcare, our pre-K to 12 schools cannot come back, and neither can our economy. A Center for American Progress report predicted as many as 20% of DC childcare facilities would be permanently closed by the end of the health crisis. In a city with already astronomical childcare costs, too few seats, and providers that struggle to make ends meet, this is an urgent priority. We support the specific budget asks of the Under 3 DC Coalition for relief grants for childcare centers, incentives for currently operating centers, and gap-filling reimbursements.
Second, current planning anticipates an August 31st return date to school in what will likely be a hybrid of in-person and distance learning. We are concerned that current plans will not allow for a sufficient amount of time to focus on the social, emotional needs and trauma of our students before launching back into the traditional curriculum. Our recovery plan called for at least a 4 to 6 week period at the beginning of the next year that focuses both on social-emotional well-being, trauma-informed care, and closure for the unfinished 2019-2020 school year. We call on the DC Council to substantially increase funding for school-based mental health services and put a new focus on the need for bilingual school psychologists, social workers, and counselors. As we consider how to shift our priorities from policing to social services, it's worth considering that the current MPD contract with DC Public Schools is worth $20 million, an amount that would pay for 181 new school social workers, counselors, and psychologists.
We call on the DC Council to substantially increase funding for school-based mental health services and put a new focus on the need for bilingual social workers, school counselors, and psychologists. As we consider how to shift our priorities from policing to social services, it's worth considering that the current MPD contract with DC Public Schools is worth $20 million. That amount of money could cover 181 new psychologists, social workers, and school counselors.
As part of our recommended recovery approach, we want to ensure that as we address learning loss, we do not forget the critical importance of a well-rounded experience for our students. We must not forsake physical education, the arts, language, social studies, science, and electives in an effort to rush to make up reading and math loss. Research shows students are more likely to gain in reading, especially when they have a stronger foundation of a broad array of content. And with the time in social isolation over the last months, students will need this more than ever. A focus on civics will be of critical importance at such a historic moment when not only the pandemic, but the movement for Black lives has affected our students so deeply. Time to process what is happening in the world is important for students at all levels.
Third, we must put a particular focus on students with disabilities and English language learners in our recovery. In May, EmpowerEd held 2 town halls, which we'd encourage you to watch, that included teachers, principals, parents, and advocates in a discussion on how to best support ELL and SPED students during distance learning and recovery to inform policymakers, principals, and others as they make critical decisions. Both of these groups of students will need additional support, which is why we believe that additional funding is needed to pay for distance learning tools and resources to help students with disabilities learn from home, to address and eliminate language access and distance learning, and for the additional staff needed to ensure we must legally require IEP goals and continue to provide individual and differentiated support for these students. We propose revising budgets to add 2 comprehensive staffing model positions, one for ELL and one for special education for all schools. We also recommend the Council immediately adopt Councilmember Trayon White's critical at-risk funding to provide additional support to those schools with the highest concentration of students deemed at risk. We recommend the critical at-risk formula then be applied to the current budget so those schools, which will also have students most at risk of significant learning loss, will have the additional resources they need to combat it and recover equitably. By defunding policing and increasing funding for social workers, counselors, school psychologists, special education support, English language learners, and dedicated funds for our most at-risk students, we can show our commitment to a fundamental rethinking of our city's priorities and ensure equity is more than a cliche.
We know staffing will be a challenge in the coming year. Many educators with pre-existing conditions, such as myself, may not be able to return to school in person. And the need for social distancing and reduced class sizes will almost certainly require additional staff to run effectively. For that reason, though we appreciate that unlike some places, our schools are not facing a budget cut, the 3% increase only keeps pace, and any equitable recovery plan requires us to increase staff and supports. For that reason, we strongly call on the council to consider raising additional revenue for both education and other critical city services for our most vulnerable communities. We've heard some say that now is not the time to raise revenue. In a city where a teacher earning $60,000 a year pays the same tax rate as a CEO making $350,000 a year, it's hard to see how a progressive DC council doesn't see the need for a more equitable tax policy than that. If this isn't the time for the wealthiest households, giant corporations, and real estate developers who have done so well in this city to kick in more support for those who are hanging on by a thread in this recession, when is that time? The COVID-induced recession will and already has increased homelessness and food insecurity, which hurts the students we teach. This demands a strong response from the council. We've all seen how our city's Black residents have borne the greatest burden from COVID-19 and from the continued systemic racism in our country. Balancing the budget on their backs in this moment cannot be an option.
Fourth, we call on the DC Council to increase funding for out-of-school time programming. While the definition of out-of-school time is certainly a moving target these days, we know that the kinds of programs funded as out-of-school time will be more critical supports for our students as they provide not only enrichment but also mentorship.
Finally, we want to address the proposal for co-locating DC charter schools inside DCPS buildings. It's clear that in the coming school year, co-location will be impossible with the precautions needed for social distancing, but it goes beyond that. I've personally served in 2 schools that are co-located. I believe co-location serves neither school. In both cases, one school grew to the point of needing the entire building. The process for untangling that relationship is always messy. It can drag on for years, with neither school able to fully serve their student population, and collaboration between the two growing progressively worse. The relationship can make it difficult for either to host the kind of community school programming that they desire. It can make it difficult to schedule lunch, for the use of outdoor space, and a lot of other logistical challenges. It's difficult to understand how much of a logistical nightmare it can be without living it yourself. And finally, we want our DCPS schools to expand, as many are already to meet their capacity. So by putting another school in the same building, we're setting an artificial growth limit that becomes hard to undo. This frustrates effort at improvements. It increases community and to increase community buy-in for precisely the schools that are doing the most to gain it. Sure, the rent money helps pay for a large building, but the consequences are not worth the cost. Listen to those who have experienced it before.
When times are tough, our budget choices reflect our values with more clarity than ever. We can choose to cut back to allow the wealthiest to stand by while our most vulnerable residents suffer, or we can make a statement that real equity involves those with more giving more. We can choose to increase budgets for policing while simply keeping our school funding stable, or we can understand the message of the moment and divert funding to our social programs, beginning in our schools. That truly builds generational opportunity and safety. We hope you'll hear our educators' message and make the investments our students and families need.